Out in the dry heart of nowhere, where the wind carries more memory than sound, a cowboy lived a life of few words. His hands knew the earth, his boots knew the dust, but his name had almost been forgotten, even by the town he once rode for. He didn't want much. A cup of coffee that stayed warm, a sun that didn't burn too cruelly, and a sky that stayed quiet. But that changed the day he saw a collapsed Apache boy in the sand, barely breathing, barely a shadow of life. With no one else in sight, he offered the last drop of water he had. That one gesture, simple as it was, echoed louder than any. Gunshot. What came next wasn't justice. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't war. It was memory. And memory rides heavy when 200 warriors appear the next morning, without a word, circling a town that had tried to forget. Before we ride deeper into the dust, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to know who's sharing this fire with us, across time zones and silence. It's slow-burning Western tailies, mystery. In the wind, and stories wrapped in silence are your kind of nightfall, leave a like. And if you want to walk beside us through more forgotten trails like this, hit subscribe. It means more than you know. Now breathe in slow. The dust remembers what people forget. Out where maps faded into guesswork and wind erased trails faster than boots could leave them, a cowboy rode into the throat of a breathless afternoon. The land beneath him was cracked and pale, parched like the bones of long-dead cattle, the sun hovering overhead like a vulture with nowhere else to circle. He wasn't riding with purpose, not anymore. Time had unstitched meaning from his days, and now he simply moved one hoof beat at a time into silence. His horse, a tired chestnut gelding named Whiskey, snorted uneasily. That's when the cowboy saw it, a shape too still to be brush or rock. He pulled back on the reins and dismounted, boots kicking up dust that didn't bother to rise far before falling again. There, curled into himself in the shallow depression of a dry creek bed, was a boy barely 13, maybe younger. Apache by the look of him. His face was streaked with dirt, lips split and dry. His chest fluttered like a trapped bird's wing breath. Shallow, almost not there. The cowboy crouched beside him, not speaking. Words were useless here. Instead, he opened his canteen, letting the last few drops touch the boy's lips. At first, nothing, then a twitch, a swallow. The boy stirred. Not awake, not aware, but alive. That was something. Beads strung on rawhide peeked from the child's shirt, tribal markings, sacred to someone. And in his clenched hand, a leather pouch. The cowboy didn't touch it. He knew better than to disturb things that looked back at you from older places. The wind shifted. A small thing, but enough. The cowboy looked to the horizon. Flat, quiet, but the land was listening. It always listened. He lifted the boy gently and placed him across the saddle. His own legs would carry him the rest of the way. As he led Whiskey toward the outline of distant hills, he didn't see the figures that began to move behind those ridgelines. But they saw him. 200 riders, painted, silent, moving as one, and the earth didn't protest. Because some debts aren't owed by men, but by the ground they walk on. The cowboy's thoughts wandered like the tumbleweeds that often drifted past his campfires at dusk. Once he might have sat with other men, told jokes, swapped stories, passed around a tin cup filled with something stronger than coffee. But those days had burned away like morning mist. Now he shared his fire with silence, and silence never interrupted. He wondered, not for the first time, what it meant to live this way, half man, half memory, riding between days like shadows across canyon walls. Each hoofstep echoed hollow in the basin of his chest. His coat hung loose, dust-covered, stitched at the shoulders by time and regret. Even his rifle, slung across his back, felt more like a burden than protection. But seeing the boy, their bones, like reeds, skin pulled tight as bark, life ebbing between the lines of his palms. Something returned. Not loudly. Just a pulse. A flicker. Something human. Something forgotten. The boy didn't speak, but his breath, shallow as it was, told a story. A boy like that, alone in a place like this, meant there was more coming. That the silence that had ruled the land was breaking. And it wasn't breaking gently. The cowboy walked through a heat that bent light, each step raising ghosts from the ground. He didn't look back, didn't need to. Whatever watched him now had no use for his eyes, only his choices. He had made one, and that was enough. In his pocket was a bullet he'd carried for 15 years. It wasn't for someone else. It was for a promise. And he thought, not for the first time, whether this would be the day he used it. But the boy still breathed. And so the cowboy kept walking. Toward whatever waited beyond the rise. Toward history. Toward a reckoning that didn't need names. The cowboy didn't know how far he had walked until the shadow found him. A solitary mesquite tree stood like a silent sentinel in the wasteland, offering the only patch of shade for miles. There, beneath its twisted limbs, he laid the boy down, gently, like laying a secret in the dust. The sun pressed down without mercy, but the tree whispered something softer, something older. The cowboy unhooked his canteen, the leather warm, nearly empty. He shook it once, one last mouthful, maybe less. Without hesitation, he knelt and let the final drops trickle between the child's lips. The boy's face twitched. A flicker of life where before there had been only stillness. His chest rose once, then again, shallow but steady. The cowboy watched without blinking. In his world, miracles didn't come with thunder. They came quiet, uncertain like this. He leaned against the tree, eyes scanning the horizon. But the land gave nothing away. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching, weighing. He noticed how the boy's fingers clutched something at his chest, a pouch worn and frayed, tied, with a cord of sinew and beads that looked older than either of them. He didn't touch it. The wind picked up, slow and circular, drawing little spirals in the dust. There was a smell in the air, creosote and old smoke, the ghost of a fire long out. It reminded him of places he'd never been, but still remembered. The boy stirred again, his lips parting just slightly. No words, only breath. That was enough. The cowboy knew he couldn't stay here long. Shade was mercy, but only for a moment. He listened to the silence as if it might speak. There was no sound but the whisper of heat and the low hum of flies circling far off. And yet, somewhere in his gut, he felt it, that unspoken certainty that the boy had not come alone. He remembered stories, the kind old scouts told with half laughter and half fear, about eyes that watched from hills, about warriors who moved with wind and waited with stone patience. He didn't believe them then. He believed them now. He shifted, wiping his brow with a sleeve that felt more dust than cloth. He looked down again. The boy was watching him now, barely, through lashes heavy as dusk. But there was focus there. Recognition? Hope? Maybe just memory. Maybe just need. The cowboy didn't ask. He simply nodded. That was enough between men, and maybe enough between strangers. He pulled a blanket from his saddle and placed it over the boy's frame, shielding what little strength remained. And then he waited. The kind of waiting that isn't about time but about readiness. The wind passed once more, and the branches above them whispered, not in language, in memory, in warning, in welcome. The boy awoke not like someone opening his eyes, but like a soul slowly rising through layers of forgotten time. His breath came first, not steady, not strong, but real. Ragged inhales tore softly through cracked lips, drawing the dust of the desert and something older into fragile lungs. His eyelids fluttered, unsure whether to lift or fall again, as if still caught between two worlds, one filled with silence, the other with something more terrifying, return, a few feet away. The cowboy sat cross-legged on the cracked earth. His back leaned against the gnarled limb of a mesquite tree that had stood longer than the town he once rode for. His shadow stretched thin beside him, broken by twigs, dry roots, and the occasional shimmer of heat-warped air. He didn't look directly at the boy, didn't speak, didn't move. Instead, he listened, every breath, every shift in dust beneath. The boy's body, every rustle of fabric or insect wing carried in the wind. There was a rhythm to it all, not music, not noise. Just the world speaking slowly again after holding its breath. The boy's eyes finally opened. They were deep, dark, and strangely still like ancient wells where stars drowned quietly. He didn't panic, didn't gasp or scramble to rise. He simply looked, not at the cowboy, not at the sky. Somewhere beyond, as if he were seeing through the day, through time, through the very fabric of what had been lost. The cowboy didn't meet his gaze directly, but he felt it all the same. It was a quiet weight, a presence, a question without shape. No fear lingered in the boy's expression, no confusion. Instead, his face wore something far older and unspoken. Recognition, the kind passed between people who remember each other from dreams they can't explain. He blinked once, slowly, the kind of blink that tasted the air and judged it safe. Then his hand, fingers cracked but steady, rose toward the cord at his neck. The cowboy noticed the movement but didn't tense. The beads had been visible before clinking, softly as the boy breathed shallowly through unconsciousness. But now they moved with purpose, and the cowboy knew better than to interfere. There were things in this world carried not for decoration, but for memory. And memory had weight. The boy hesitated. His fingers lingered on the cord, not out of fear, but out of reverence. It was as though he wasn't asking permission from the man beside him, but from the tree above, the earth below, or the ancestors, whose whispers danced in the wind. Something invisible lingered in that still air. Something that watched, that waited. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, the boy slipped the cord over his head. It fell into his open palm, coiling softly like a snake returning to its den. The pouch was small, no bigger than a closed fist. Its leather was worn smooth, edges frayed, beads faded from what might have once been vibrant blue and crimson. There was a scent to it, too, something like cedar, like old smoke, like stories told around fires too far from home. And it pulsed, not visibly, not literally, but spiritually. It carried meaning in a way objects seldom do. Like it remembered, being touched by generations of grief and love in equal measure. Still, the cowboy didn't reach. He simply watched. The boy extended his arm, no ceremony, no words. But everything about the gesture carried ceremony, reverence, resolve. He was offering something more than a pouch. He was offering history, trust, and a kind of thanks that could only be given by one who had seen the edge and been pulled back. By another, the cowboy moved, not fast, not hesitant either, just careful. He reached forward with hands stained by years of dust, blood, and hard work. Hands that had held rifles, shovels, reins, and once, long ago, a wedding ring. And now, they reached not for a weapon or a tool, but for something fragile, something sacred. His fingers brushed the pouch as one might brush the petals of a dying flower. He took it into his hand like he was lifting a newborn bird, gently, slowly, fully aware that some things are not touched, they're accepted. The boy's hand remained still, and once the pouch passed between them, he lowered his arm, exhaling a breath so soft it barely moved the air. The cowboy didn't speak. He nodded, just once. But the motion held more weight than a sermon, more grace, than a song. It wasn't just a thank you, it was an oath. A promise made in dust and silence. The kind of gesture men used before language was invented. Neither of them said anything. Neither needed to. And still, the silence stretched on, not heavy, now but full. Full of something understood. The cowboy's eyes fell to the pouch again. He didn't open it. He didn't even tighten his grip, just held it, felt it. It was light in weight, but heavy in presence. Inside, he imagined, were tokens. Not meant to be seen, only carried. A chip of obsidian maybe. A lock of hair. A carving, ashes, a prayer. Or perhaps just dust infused with the memory of a family, a village, a tribe. Dust that had seen rain and fire, birth and ruin. He rested the pouch gently on the fabric of his worn trousers, placing it in his lap like one might place a child down to sleep. The boy's gaze hadn't left him. Now their eyes met, not as strangers, not even as allies, but as something more uncertain, more profound. Two beings who had no name for the bond now forged between them. The cowboy saw him, not just the child, but everything that clung to him. The sorrow, the survival, the lineage that hummed quietly beneath his skin. He saw the faces of those who would never rise again, who had poured their last words into this boy's bones. He saw a future too, vaguely drawn but undeniably important. He gave another small nod. The boy returned it, just a fraction of movement, but enough. That was how they spoke now. The mesquite branches above rustled softly, not from wind, but perhaps from memory. A leaf twisted loose, spiraling down in the thin beam of light that had begun to break through the canopy. It landed between them. The cowboy looked at it. The boy did too. Neither said what they were thinking. That everything, even this moment, would fall eventually. But not before it was seen. Not before it mattered. The cowboy shifted his weight, bones cracking quietly in protest. He rose slowly, knees stiff, coat settling across his shoulders like old regret. The pouch remained in his hand. He reached to his chest pocket, where a space had long been empty, and tucked it inside. Not hidden, but protected, close to the heart, where it belonged. The boy followed the motion with his eyes, and then, slowly, he too began to move. He didn't speak, didn't stand, but he turned his body slightly toward the cowboy, as if aligning himself with whatever came next. His strength was still new, still uncertain, but growing. The cowboy gave one last glance to the horizon. The world hadn't changed, not outwardly. The sky still burned. The earth still cracked, but something unseen had shifted. A current had changed course, and in its wake, two lives now drifted toward something neither fully understood, but both had chosen. And in that silence, where no birds sang and no voices dared disturb the air, a bond was sealed, not with ink, not with blood, but with dust, and the kind of thanks that only silence can hold. The ride back to town stretched longer than memory, as if every hoofbeat carried a question too heavy for the wind to answer. The boy rested across the saddle, limbs still, face pale beneath streaks of dust and sweat, and the cowboy led his horse. Without hurry, but without pause. Ahead, the town simmered in the distance like a mirage stitched from guilt and broken promises. He hadn't seen it in years, not since the fire, not since the storm of bullets and silence that came after. But now he came with a child who should have died, and that alone changed the air. As he crossed into town, boots hit wood with dull thuds, and shutters drew closed like blinking eyes. A woman pulled her child inside. A shopkeeper froze with a sack of flour halfway to his counter, and the blacksmith stared too long before returning to his hammer. The sheriff stood in front of his office, hat low, arms folded, jaw tight. "You sure about this?" he asked. The cowboy didn't stop walking. He needed saving. The sheriff nodded once, slow. "That ain't what I asked." "No more," was said, but others filled the silence. "He's Apache. They'll come. You just brought trouble on all of us." The cowboy heard every word but answered none. He walked toward the clinic, where Doc Clemens hadn't had much company since the fever took half the valley. On the steps, the doc stood with an old kerchief wrapped around his neck and eyes that had seen too much. "Put him inside," the doctor said. "I'll do what I can." The cowboy carried the boy in, No one followed, no one helped. He laid the child gently on a cot beside a window cracked open to the rustle of dry wind and the faint clang of a distant bell. The boy's eyes flickered but did not open. Beads around his neck caught the light, casting tiny colors on the wall. Outside, the air thickened. The townsfolk watched from doorways, muttering. The sheriff walked to the edge of Main Street and stared toward the hills. "Something's out there," he said. No one answered. The cowboy stepped back out into the dust, silent. His face carried no anger, only resolve. "If they come," he said softly, "they come for him. I'll be waiting." The wind carried that promise into the crevices of every boarded window and forgotten alley. The town was still, but not at peace. Not anymore. All through the night, the wind refused to speak. It hung above the town like a forgotten breath, trapped somewhere between yesterday's dust and tomorrow's reckoning. The moon looked on like a silent witness, casting shadows that stretched and thinned across the rooftops of buildings too tired to stand tall anymore. The cowboy didn't sleep. He sat outside the doctor's office, hat tipped forward, shotgun across his knees, eyes half closed but ears wide open. Inside, the boy slept, still breathing, but not stirring, his chest rising like a soft whisper under a worn wool blanket. Nothing moved. Not even the bats in the rafters or the coyotes beyond the hills. The kind of stillness that felt borrowed, and the kind that always asks to be paid back by dawn. When morning finally crept in, it didn't announce itself with birdsong or warmth. It came with a thin streak of pale fire across the horizon, and with it, the wind returned. Not loud, not angry, just steady and purposeful. The first to feel it were the weathered flags on the old saloon's porch, then the brittle shutters on the undertaker's parlor. Dust picked up in little swirls at first, like the land was stretching. But soon, the lookout at the church steeple saw it movement. Far out, along the basin, dozens at first. Then more, silhouettes on horseback, not galloping, just approaching. Like a tide. The sheriff was already awake, sipping bitter coffee from a tin cup, when the first horn was heard, not a war cry, but a long low note that made every man's heart twist in his chest. He stepped outside, saw the cowboy standing still as iron. Eyes locked on the horizon. "How many?" he asked. The cowboy didn't blink. Too many to count. But they're not hiding. By now the town was stirring, people emerging from homes with questions on their lips and fear in their eyes. The preacher clutched his Bible like it could stop arrows. A boy climbed to the church roof and whistled low. They've surrounded. U.S. But there were no torches, no raised weapons. Just riders, still as statues, forming a ring beyond rifle range. The wind carried the faint sound of rattles and beads, the creak of leather, the breath of horses waiting. The cowboy looked down at his hands. "They're waiting," he muttered. "For what?" the sheriff asked. The cowboy turned slightly. For him to wake up, silence again. But this one didn't feel empty. It felt full. Full of eyes, of memory, of consequences long delayed. The boy inside the clinic stirred in his sleep, one hand reaching up, fingers curling around something. Unseen. Outside, the wind shifted once more, this time not toward the town, but around it, like it chose to go silent again. Watching, listening, waiting. They did not arrive with horns or flames, but with a silence so vast it seemed to stretch the very air tight across the dry earth. 200 Apache warriors stood at the edge of town in a long and perfect line, motionless as statues carved. By time itself, mounted on horses as still as stone, their faces neither angry nor calm, but something far older, a look that remembered things the town had forgotten or never dared to know. From the first pale light of morning, they had appeared on the ridges like ghosts climbing out of the soil, and as the sun climbed, they had come closer, not rushing, not hiding, just approaching as if the ground itself owed them a path, until they reached the outer fence where the town's land turned to wild silence, And there they stopped, not one word spoken, not one weapon raised, only the heavy breathing of horses and the dry rattle of beads and feathers moving in the windless air. The townsfolk gathered slowly, drawn by something they didn't understand, men clutching tools they didn't need, women holding children close, old folks peering from windows with memories flickering behind tired eyes. And in front of them, all stood the boy, no longer lying in a cot, no longer half dead, but awake, upright, his feet firm on the wooden porch of the doctor's office, facing the horizon as if he had heard their arrival in a dream before they even came. His small frame did not tremble, and though he said nothing, the line of warriors watched him with eyes that softened only once in a generation. The cowboy stood beside him, weathered and silent, a figure of dust and decisions made long ago. Shotgun lowered, hat in hand, not as protector, but as witness. No order was given, no gesture exchanged, but the town held its breath, waiting for something to break, the air, the silence, or the rules they thought they understood. The sheriff stepped forward, alone, hat lowered to shade the worry in his eyes, and he spoke not to the warriors, but to the boy. "Do you know them?" he asked, and the boy, still without a word, stepped off the porch and walked forward, one step, two steps, until his bare feet touched the dirt where nothing grew. From among the warriors one dismounted, an elder with skin like bark and eyes like old rivers, and he came forward slowly, every movement deliberate, until he knelt and placed his hand upon the boy's chest, above the tiny leather pouch still hanging from his neck. He looked to the cowboy then, and nodded, not in thanks, not in surrender, but in recognition. The wind shifted, faint and dry, and in that moment, the line of warriors bowed their heads as one, not to the town, not to the law, but to the child who had returned from death, not as an orphan, but as something carried home by honor and fate. No one in town moved, no one breathed deep, because some silences are not meant to be broken, only heard with the bones and the dust and the parts of us that remember things our words have forgotten. The Apache chief stepped down from his horse with the slow grace of someone whose body carried the weight of memory, not age. Every movement was deliberate, his moccasins touching the dust as if acknowledging the land itself before he took another step. His face was carved with time, lines like riverbeds, and eyes dark and deep as unspoken stories. The town didn't move, not a breath, not a murmur. The chief approached the boy, who stood still beneath the porch's shadow, a presence far larger than his small frame suggested, and for a moment, neither of them blinked, two lives joined by silence and recognition beyond words. Then the chief reached out, his weathered hand slow and trembling not from weakness, but reverence, and placed his palm gently on the boy's forehead, letting it rest there as if to feel whether the spirit within was whole again. Something passed between them in that touch, like smoke through a keyhole or a name whispered down a canyon wall, and when the chief stepped back, his eyes glistened not with tears, but with the sheen of sacred knowing. He turned toward the cowboy next and walked with the same slow certainty, stopping only inches away. The cowboy stood firm, shoulders squared but gaze lowered, not out of fear but out of understanding. There are men who earn words, and then there are those who deserve silence. The chief lowered his head in a gesture that said more than any spoken thanks ever could, and held it there, long enough for the dust to settle around his boots. The cowboy didn't move, but his chest lifted once in a breath that had been waiting for years. And then, without a command, without a signal, every warrior on horseback bowed their heads in perfect unison. 200 men offering not submission, not allegiance, but something deeper, recognition of a moment when fate bent its shape to honor life saved and memory restored. The town behind them held its collective breath, the sheriff swallowing hard, the townspeople blinking away confusion and awe. No one spoke, because even the children felt it. This was not just a meeting, not just a return. This was a ritual, older than fences and bullets, older than right and wrong. The boy turned then, eyes scanning the line of riders who had waited their whole lives for a reason to bow again. And though he said nothing, the slight lift of his chin was enough. He knew who he was now. The chief stepped back into line, mounted his horse, and the warriors remained still, waiting for the wind to speak again. But in that suspended breath of earth and sky and men, one truth rose like heat from cracked stone. Some bonds are written in blood, others in silence, but the ones forged in sacrifice echo longer than drums or gunfire. It started not with a shout or a warning, but with a whisper, a single voice breaking through the stunned quiet that had gripped the town like frost on autumn fields. An old man, bent from years and hollowed by stories no one asked to hear, stepped forward from the line of townsfolk gathered near the general store. His cane tapped the wooden step as he moved, but his voice, though thin, was sharp as a nail. That boy. Maybe he's the life we once took. Maybe he's what was returned. The words hovered in the air like smoke that wouldn't rise. People looked at one another, but no one contradicted him. The cowboy turned slowly, his brows low and uncertain. He looked at the old man not like he understood, but like he feared that he soon would. The Apache warriors hadn't moved. The boy hadn't moved either. But something had shifted, like the town itself tilted slightly beneath their boots. No one spoke. The weight of the old man's words sank deeper than dust, rooting itself into the timber bones of every building. The blacksmith swallowed hard, wiping suitless hands on his apron. A woman clutched her son's shoulder as if to pull him backward in time. The preacher murmured scripture under his breath, words meant for funerals, not reckonings. The cowboy, still facing the boy and the warriors beyond, ran a calloused hand across his jaw. His mouth opened, then closed again. Some truths don't fit inside words. The cowboy stepped forward, just one pace, the creak of his boot leather, louder than any voice. What did we do? He asked, not to the boy, not to the warriors, but to the town behind him. The silence that followed was not the kind that waits for answers. It was the kind that knew them already. The old man took a breath, his shoulders heavy. Years ago, he said, we turned away a group. Refugees, some called them. Trespassers. Others, they came with their children starving, tired. We had nothing left but guilt, so we told them to leave. They begged. They even offered their jewelry, gifts passed down generations. We turned our backs, told them to find water elsewhere. Days later, we found their bodies past the canyon, dehydrated, cradling their dead. There was a child among them, about that boy's age now, maybe younger. The old man's voice cracked, and the rest of the town didn't breathe. The cowboy stared into the dust, seeing images the old man hadn't spoken, but that were now burned into the inside of every closed eye. He could feel the boy standing beside him, and it was as though the space between them carried the full weight of the town's shame. The warriors said nothing. Their silence was a sentence not yet served. The boy, still watching, reached up and touched the small pouch at his chest, the one the cowboy had seen in the desert. Slowly, he opened it, pulling out a single carved stone, smooth and black with a red etching that shimmered in the sunlight. The old man gasped. "If..." As the sun began to lower itself behind the hills, casting long, amber shadows across the dusty stretch of land where tension had once knotted every breath, the Apache warriors moved in unison, as if the silence itself commanded their retreat. One by one, their horses turned, hooves shifting the earth, but not in haste, not in fear. There was no urgency in their departure. It was the kind of leaving that honored something too sacred for words, a quiet that would echo through the town, long after the dust settled. At the edge of the silent procession, a single horse remained behind, not riderless by accident, but by design. Its reins were looped neatly over the fence post near the boy. The chief, still atop his mount, turned slightly and let the cowboy's gaze across the distance. No words, no nod. Just eyes ancient, steady, and knowing. The cowboy understood. It wasn't just a gesture of thanks, it was a calling. The boy, too, turned his head, not quickly, not with fear, but with a kind of calm resignation to whatever came next. The cowboy stepped forward, boots crunching softly in the settling dust, and stopped beside the boy. For a long moment, neither of them looked at each other. The wind stirred, picking up faint whispers from the dry grass. The boy laid a hand on the horse's mane, not to mount, not yet, but as if remembering what it meant to belong somewhere. The cowboy's eyes drifted from the horizon to the reins, and then to the boy. Something unspoken passed between them, an agreement, perhaps, or ... The sun had climbed halfway toward its throne in the wide, open sky, but the town still lingered in a hush, as if the dust hadn't yet settled from something much larger than hoofbeats. From the porch of the saloon to the steps of the church, folk stood in silence, their eyes not on each other, but on the two figures moving slowly down the main road. The cowboy rode with his spine straight, but his soul quieter than it had ever been. Beside him, not behind, the Apache boy matched his pace, the reins in his hands gentle on the saddle horn, his eyes forward, fixed on something the others couldn't see. They rode not as fugitives or heroes, but as a promise made flesh. Behind them, the townspeople remained frozen, not from fear, not from awe, but from something deeper, the sudden weight of memory. Some remembered the water they once denied. Others thought of the children buried without names. The preacher lowered his head, the banker removed his hat. The schoolteacher wept without understanding why. In that moment, they weren't just watching two figures ride away. They were witnessing something long buried crawl back into the light. A debt they thought forgotten, now repaid not in coin, but in courage. The boy looked ahead, but occasionally his gaze shifted to the cowboy, as if measuring the space that once held fear and now held trust. Birds circled high above, and the breeze carried with it the scent of mesquite and distant rain. The cowboy didn't look back. He knew better than to steal peace from a moment.